Imagine spending the entire day under the warm Mediterranean sun in a little garden behind your house. The air is filled with the scent of fresh basil, and the tomatoes have finally ripened. So one by one, you pick them and carefully place them into your wicker basket. And slowly, the air starts to cool. It's almost dinner time, so with a basket full of freshly picked tomatoes, you make your way through the narrow streets towards your Nona's house. The sun is beginning to set. The cobblestone streets, the warm terracotta walls, and the ivy climbing between the windows are all bathed in golden light. And today, we'll be exploring a highly romanticized version of Italy, one that exists primarily in watercolor paintings and daydreams. Hi, my name's Ray. Ciao. Welcome. This is a series I like to call Cottagecore Around the World, where I combine modern cottagecore aesthetics with cultural and folk inspirations from different places around the globe. Unlike some of my other videos, this is less of a heavily researched deep dive into historical fashions and beauty standards, and more of a I had a Pinterest board and a dream kind of situation. And because I like to suffer, I started with the background. And to any environmental artists out there who genuinely enjoy drawing backgrounds, why? You are a psychopath. And I'm only saying that because I'm very jealous. So if you possess any forbidden knowledge required to enjoy this shit, please feel free to leave your secrets in the comments down below. Because all the advice I've received can essentially be summarized as trust the process. Unfortunately, I have severe trust issues. I do not trust the process. Anyway, Clip Studio has a very handy perspective ruler, so I used it to create this street. I also used this squiggly brush to give the line art a slightly imperfect, hand-drawn look because my illustrations have a tendency to end up looking a little too rigid. So, in order to appear spontaneous, every line was carefully planned. You know what they say, fake it till you make it. This was fun. And this detail only exists for the two people who are gonna zoom in on it and not notice it because I think I end up blurring it later on. This was a great use of my time. Anyway, then I decided to move to some architectural details that might actually matter and contribute to the final picture. So I went back to my Pinterest board and pulled up this reference. Now, the perspective on the store is definitely questionable, but the vibes are good, and that's what's important today. Vibes. And after trying to save it with the liquify tool and failing, cause it's a liquify tool, not a miracle worker, I added some hatching for an extra artsy effect, laid down some base colors for the background, and decided this was the absolute bare minimum required to qualify as a background. So I abandoned it. Temporarily. We'll get back to it. For now, we're going to quietly move the problem out of sight and turn our attention to the main focus of this illustration, our Italian cottagecore girl. And this arm is entirely too long, but I only noticed that after I finished the illustration, so we're not going to talk about it. Let's talk about something else. This particular illustration isn't just inspired by the broader cottagecore aesthetic, but an even more specific internet aesthetic and micro-trend called Tomato Girl Summer. And ever since I heard about it, it's been living rent-free in my head. So I had to do something about it. And I would love to tell you it's because of the beautiful Mediterranean aesthetics, but no, it's the tomatoes. I love tomatoes. Now, for those of you who actually touch grass and haven't encountered this particular microtrend before, here's the definition from the Aesthetic Wiki. Tomato Girl Summer is a fashion and lifestyle micro-trend that proliferated on TikTok and Instagram during the summer of 2023. It is characterized by a romanticized and highly stylized vision of life in the Mediterranean, particularly the Amalfi Coast in Italy, Santorini in Greece, and the Balearic Islands in Spain. The aesthetic functions as a form of escapism, allowing participants to project an image of vacationing in Europe regardless of their actual geographic location or financial situation, but we're not going to talk about that because we're here to romanticize Italy and dream of a Mediterranean summer. And dreaming is free. So I decided to combine this aesthetic with cottagecore to design a character that feels more like a local and less like a tourist. In my, of course, highly romanticized version of Italy, since I've never actually been there. Actually, that's a lie. I have been to Italy. For one day. Anyway, I looked up Tomato Girl Summer on Pinterest, and there were a lot of headscarves. So naturally, I gave her a little headscarf. But enough about highly specific internet microtrends. It was time to get serious and look at least a few actual Italian folk costumes. So I found these references from Tuscany and Sicily, and one thing that really stood out to me was the layering. They have these really cool V-shaped necklines and these overlapping layers that almost look like a shawl or two draped around the shoulders. So I decided to incorporate that in my design. A lot of the references also had these corset-like bodices and vests, so I added an underbust corset to kind of hint to that. Many of them also included aprons, which I chose not to include. Not because I have anything personal against aprons, I just felt like they pushed the design too far into full costume territory, and away from the more modern cottagecore aesthetic I was trying to achieve. So anyway, I gave this dress some flowy sleeves, a little more lace, and kept the skirt fairly simple since we can only see a small portion of it. But to keep things visually interesting, the skirt is flowing dramatically in the Mediterranean breeze. And then of course I moved on to the most important accessory of this outfit, the tomatoes. I most likely would have benefited from looking up some references for this wicker basket, but I was lazy, so I winged it. It was time to move on to the base colors. I usually don't outline the hair and prefer to sketch it directly onto this layer. And speaking of the hair, I'll give you a few seconds to spot where I fucked up. Headscarves are meant to keep the hair out of your face. So, whatever's going on the left side is not physically possible. Fortunately, before finishing this illustration, I did eventually remember how headscarves work. But for the remainder of this speed paint, you'll just have to look at this. Anyway, I gave our Italian girl here a warm tan complexion and dark brown hair. And of course, the dominant color for the outfit is red. I colored the wicker basket and gave her green eyes because subtlety and I don't get along. And with the red and the white, I was already 2/3 of the way to the Italian flag, so I had to go all the way. Then I tried something with the hair that looked pretty cool, and I actually thought I was onto something, but I was not. It didn't really work out in the end, but we'll get to that when we inevitably have to return to the background. The hair not having an outline has its downsides. I added this polka dot pattern to the dress, and then I found this flower asset that I thought would look really nice on the corset. So I colored that, modified it, and spent way too much time trying to make it work. It didn't. It was a little too detailed and three-dimensional compared to the rest of the illustration, so it had to go. So I took another look at the reference that inspired this, and I decided to draw this poppy pattern by hand, adding again a little touch of green. And this actually fit in with the rest of the drawing and felt a lot less offensive. And before I could move on to rendering all this, there was still a problem that needed to be addressed. I needed to fully commit to making this background less sad. So I added some ivy. which had the added benefit of more green. I also added these potted plants for even more green. Then went back to this reference and noticed this beautiful variation in the brickwork around the doorway. So I borrowed that idea and painted these bricks in different shades of brown and terracotta. I also noticed there was a lot of color variation in the painted wood, so I started with this kind of green underpainting and then added blue on top of it to try and mimic that classic, slightly imperfect watercolor effect. Then I added some basic shading to the environment and drew these horizontal lines to add texture to the shutters. After that, I moved on to coloring the buildings and the sky, bringing some life back into the background. Then I also added this subtle cobblestone texture to the street to kind of tie everything together. And after a few more details here and there, it was time to integrate our main character into the environment. So I started with some overall soft shading and used an eraser to carve out the areas where the light would hit. And then I thought, you know what she needs? This girl would look stunning with a bold red lip. Also, a little too much blush. And listen, I don't do this often, but I will allow myself a moment of vulnerability. This illustration has more mistakes than I can count at this point. This is not my best work. I don't know what happened when I filmed this, but it was a rough week, and somewhere along the way things just didn't quite come together like I wanted them to. And I've always been a perfectionist, so a few years ago I would have definitely abandoned this project and it would have never seen the light of day. But now I like to think of myself as a recovering perfectionist. So one thing I'm still learning is that not every piece needs to be perfect to be worth finishing. Sometimes you just have to say fuck it and put things out into the world anyway. Because even when it doesn't turn out exactly how you imagined, there's still value in it. There's always value in learning. And if that's the best thing I can get out of this piece, then maybe that's fine. So we persevere. Okay, enough of that vulnerability. Let's finish rendering this. The girl is done. Unfortunately, I'm not. The background is still looking a little sad. So I started by fixing these plants. I wasn't happy with how they merged into the buildings, so I gave them a little squiggly outline to make them pop from the rest of the scene. Then I blurred some parts of the background to make the characters stand out a little bit more. I also added this subtle Sun City gradient map over the entire illustration to sort of help unify the colors and make the lighting feel more cohesive. I increased the contrast and turned on the street light, even though it might be a bit too early in the evening for that, but it looks cool. And after a few more changes and fixes off camera, the illustration was finally done, and so was I. Now, tragically, my fears came true. This illustration did end up looking kinda stiff and rigid. But, as the Italians say, c'est la vie. Così è la vita. Anyway, like and subscribe if you wanna see me do this again, because I refuse to be discouraged by this experience, and I will be attempting another cottagecore around the world illustration in a different part of the globe. So feel free to leave your suggestions down below. And if you prefer a more heavily researched historical fashion deep dive, I also have videos where I talk about beauty standards and attempt to recreate outfits from the Edwardian era in ancient Egypt, and they're even almost historically accurate. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.